Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Questioning Behaviour. And today I'm really excited to say we are going to talk to Colin Camerer, who is a man who needs absolutely no introduction if you've not been living under a rock and somewhat know what behavioral economics or even neuroeconomics is.
Yes, we've been so lucky to interview Colin, who is normally a very busy and well sought after man. So we are very pleased to have Colin Camerer as a guest on the podcast. And for context, a little bit of background about Colin and his career. Colin is currently a professor of behavioral finance and economics at the California Institute of Technology, or Caltech. And according to Wikipedia, he is a former child prodigy. And he got his PhD at 21. We are not kidding, which is crazy. So we are very excited to speak to Colin. And yeah, without further ado, I guess the biggest question on my mind is, if you get your PhD at age 21, you must have been interested in behavioral science and from a pretty early age. So how did you get interested in behavioral science?
Okay, so I got interested in behavioral science because when I was 12 years old, my dad and his former colleague would go to the horse races, and he was a stockbroker. So my dad wasn't interested in horses or stocks, but I was, and so was Rich. And so it was my introduction to two kinds of markets, right, which are quite similar, except the horse racing market, a bunch of animals come onto the track. They have jockeys on top. They have trainers who train them, and rich people who you don't see very often. And there's a thing called the Daily Racing Form, which is like the Wall Street Journal or the FT of horses. It's packed with information about what happened in the past performances of the horses, and who their parents were, and zillions of things. And then somehow, through some kind of like distillation, the crowd compresses all of this information into like a number, which is the chance that each horse is going to win. And then 20 minutes later, you find out what the answer is. And the stock market's similar to that, except you don't find out the answer 20 minutes later. You do find like a new price and a new price and a new price. But it's a dynamic process that goes on and on. And so I was really fascinated by how does the crowd do this? I mean, part of it was I like to bet a little bit. And, if you're a kid and you're first learning about money and work, and, I did chores around the house and stuff like that. I hated mowing the lawn. But, I thought, here's the racetrack is like an ATM, right? You give them some money, and if you're smart and lucky, they give you more money back. And you didn't have to sweat or lift anything heavy or mow the lawn. So I thought this is good. Anyway, but it was this sort of the magic, and it was clear that that it was a combination of just statistics and numbers, but also kind of psychology. Like, are there lucky numbers or are there lucky colors, and do people understand streaks? Like some jockeys will go on a winning streak or a losing streak. So, and then in talking to Rich, it was clear that it was a lot of the same things. Like later, I went to work on Wall Street one summer as a summer intern, and there was a portfolio manager at a really big, people manage a lot of money. It was J.P. Morgan, now J.P. Morgan Chase, and the portfolio manager said he said, I don't buy stocks with companies with CEOs who are overweight, because if you can't manage your weight, you can't manage your company.
Wow.
That was his theory.
I've heard reasoning like that before. Yeah.
And that's a psychological claim about trait stability, right? Like impulsivity in food and CEO management. And maybe it's true. Maybe it's just bullshit.
It can go either way.
Yeah. And actually, I think you could actually study it empirically, right? Or you could study, say, events where a CEO got sick and lost weight. Do they, or some kind of causal, try to do some kind of causal event. But the fact that, that's jumping from when I was 12 to when I was like 20-ish. But the fact that this very wealthy, successful person managed hundreds of millions of dollars and had this theory, and at that time, it was in the around 1979. If you said to him, "What's your data?" people in finance were doing quant investing, but it was pretty low tech compared to nowadays. You just didn't have Bloomberg tickers. There was, so and what's called quant investing, which is very hardcore. You just use machine learning and statistics to tell you, and you don't mess with the machine. If it tells you to buy, you buy. That was it took a long time for that to come along. Anyway, so that was sort of my introduction over a few years into things in behavioral science. And then I went to the University of Chicago Graduate School of Business, now called Booth, which was great. And I started studying finance. But finance at that time was really boring because
completely discarding the entire field. Ugh, whatever.
Well, it got better after, in the sense that there was a kind of obsession with market efficiency, which basically means whatever information is out there, like at the racetrack in Timonium, Maryland, or at the stock market, is incorporated into the price. And therefore, it's hard to beat the market, because if you think, like my son loves Tesla. He thinks Tesla's great, therefore I should buy Tesla stock. And I was explaining to him, like, you're not the only person who thinks Tesla's great, And anyway, so finance was really stuck on market efficiency, and there was no appetite for what's now called behavioral finance, which is, well, what if some investors make some mistakes some of the time? Then how would the whole model? And the view at Chicago, which was very hardcore also on this topic of market efficiency, because it was kind of developed there, was those people get wiped out of the market so quickly that they're just kind of like noise. Anyway, anyway, there's behavioral finance has really flourished since then, including at Chicago, which is sort of interesting. So I kind of missed by like 5 or 8 years. If I had come along a little later in my career, I might have been doing that exclusively. I have worked a bit on finance. Anyway, so meanwhile, Hilly Einhorn and Robin Hogarth were teaching behavioral science there. And behavioral science at Chicago in the MBA program was kind of like the antidote, because the students learned so much. Markets are great, regulation's bad, stock prices are efficient, consumers are maximizing utility.
Complex effects don't exist.
yeah, exactly. It wasn't very practical either, because it's like all these students studied finance, like, we're going to get hired to jobs to try to beat the market, and all you're telling us is that it's hard to beat the market. So they liked behavioral science because it was about mistakes. Like, people don't always use Bayes' rule. They may overweight low probabilities or dismiss them entirely. So they loved that because it sort of rounded out the picture of human nature. And they had basically no grad students, because most people didn't go there to study psychology and behavioral science. And there were, there's occasionally students from the psychology department. Like in your universities, it's often people come from other areas. So that was a blessing, because they loved having a student, and so they give me a lot of their time when I think about it. Like, we used to go to lunch once every couple of weeks, and they would just talk about things they were working on, and they kind of. I remember them treating me kind of like a peer, even though I was this second, third year grad student, I didn't know very much, and they were very helpful in thinking about dissertations and stuff like that.
This is good.
So there was sort of it was kind of unplowed territory, and so I kind of got like a big dose of economic thinking, as well as experimental psychology tools, and how do you kind of put these together. So that was the first part of my career. And where the neuroscience came in,
that's an intense story.
Yeah, exactly. So I think some of it, when I think back, is I had the kind of optimism, you might say overconfidence, of a young man. Young men are overconfident.
I do.
Yeah, we plead the fifth.
That's an empirical fact, and sometimes that's good, right? You're not going to like climb mountains or become a Navy SEAL or win the Olympics if you don't have a certain amount of base confidence and drive of some kind, And so that helped a lot, because behavioral economics was not popular at that time. I mean, it almost didn't exist. It was really, we called it judgment decision making. It was much more behavioral science rooted. That's what the people in Chicago, my advisors, were working on. Ambiguity aversion and learning, illusion of validity. Why is it that this portfolio manager is so confident that overweight CEOs can't manage companies? Like, where did he get that? What series of events and things that got stuck in his brain led him to believe in that thing, which I think is probably not true, but maybe. So they were interested in very.
We can test this. If we just overfeed some people, starve a bunch of others, see what it does.
Yeah. And actually, there is by the way, while we're on that topic, there is an emerging several studies in finance about it's usually called experiences of CEOs. Like if you're in the Army, the CEOs are more disciplined in terms of their financial management and a few things like that.
Okay.
And there's also a phenomenon called depression babies, where people who grew up during the Great Depression when there was super high unemployment, like my dad was very little, but he was probably 5 years old in the Depression, and he hated to borrow money. He didn't have credit card debt. There was this lifelong.
Might find a man.
And again, from a psychological and biological point of view, that's not surprising at all. It would be surprising if that was not the case, right? Mm-hmm. If early childhood experiences that were very dramatic didn't have some kind of lifelong impact. The neuroscience starts in 1997, and so George Lowenstein, who was a good friend of mine and sometime a collaborator at Carnegie Mellon, knew a guy called Jonathan Cohen, who was at Pitt at that time. George was at Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and George was very interested in self-control and impulsivity. So he knew some clinicians like George Ainsley, who worked with veterans, and a guy called Elliot. I can't remember his last name, but he was an expert on drug addiction. So George kind of just collected all these interesting people from outside of the narrow scope, and he basically said, "Why don't we have like a kind of like a get to know you conference, like a coffee date with some economists and some people who understand the brain or addiction and things like that." And I said, that's a great idea. So we had this meeting in 1997. And when I look back, it was kind of amazing, although it was clear it was sort of like one of these dates, so to speak, where one person does all the talking. And the people did all the talking were the clinicians and the neuroscientists. And the economists didn't really know what to say.
That's a first. A quiet economist.
Well, what it was they couldn't fit it into their framework, So like they couldn't say, economic choices, preferences, beliefs, and constraints. Which of these three is the brain violating? I mean, and I think they were afraid to put it in those terms, right? Okay. So they were kind of silently trying to figure that out. And I should say that isn't entirely true. So Paul Romer, for example, we asked him to give a little talk, and he was very interested in that time in emotion. Mm-hmm. So he gave a little sketch for how you might model emotions in this. How would you add that to the standard preferences and beliefs, constraints, maximization framework? But the thing was, the emotion researchers were just, I don't know. I'm not sure what you mean here. That's not how we think of emotion. So, and just like with other kind of relationships, it took more than a day or two to get to sort of a common language, So now when I think about emotion, I think I have a really clear, and I'll tell you how I think about it, which is I think, which influenced a little bit by how Paul Romer and others people think about it, but differently than George, which is emotions are a body's early warning system based on external stimulus or sometimes internal rumination that prepares action. And in the history of emotion research, there's a bunch of waves of this general theme, mm-hmm. That emotions kind of prepare action. But from the point of view of, say, economic decision making, emotions are fast. They're often going to be very noisy, like a signal detection. So you might get afraid more often than you really should. And it's not clear that emotions actually harm decision making because they're evolved to give you like a heads up that something threatening is happening or something good has happened to your friend and they're smiling. So it's a kind of and for humans, a lot of emotions are social. So they communicate on our faces and our bodies, right? So it's a body language of what's happening now, what may happen later, or like if I threaten you, it's kind of like broadcasting a an image. Anyway, but all those words are, I didn't say preferences, beliefs, constraints, right? Because just some emotions are like preferences. Like I might like to watch a scary movie and feel afraid and see the bad guy get killed. Like I'll pay money to have that set of emotions, right? Emotions are like beliefs, right? Because they're really information, they're guesses. And emotions also can be constraints. Like if I'm, people have a fear response, which is like freezing. So it may actually prevent me from running away quickly or something like that. But I think the right way to think about it is you can't, if you have these three categories, you can't shove every single thing about human beings into the three categories. You just have to allow some new categories.
It is a bit difficult, I'll admit to that.
Yeah. And basically, where do you get these new categories? Well, you talk to people in other disciplines who've thought about emotion for 100 years, and they know how to measure it. And even then, emotion happens to be an area I spent a lot of time reading about this when I had a chance. And it was like, okay, I'm gonna read about emotion all day long, every day for like a month, and then I'll have it figured out. And after the month, it was like, I need to read a little more. After another month, more. And it's because it's complicated, and there are different points of view, and you have to sort of come to understand them. Where are the conflicts? What are the crucial types of data we don't have? So it's sort of an inherently messy topic, but I think very interesting. Anyway, so back to our conference in 1997. So the neuroscientists did a lot of talking. The economists didn't have much to say. I think they didn't really know what questions to ask that were sort of productive. And economists, as a breed, I think are a little weak on just asking, on being humble and just saying, I don't know, can you explain this? Right?
You heard it here first. It's Colin's word, not mine.
Right? So when I talk about neuroeconomics, there's usually not nearly as much interaction. And if I'm lucky, there's a grad student or sometimes a very senior professor like Jim Heckman who says, let me see if I can understand what you're talking about. Is it X? And it's like, no, it's not really X, but at least somebody opened their mouth, right? So we're having a conversation. And it was actually looking back, here's who was at the conference besides Paul Romer, later Nobel Prize winner, Peter Diamond, who was interested in psychology a bit, and later Nobel Prize winner, Al Roth, who was in Pittsburgh and thought, this is nearby, I'll come and listen. And those are all the Nobel Prize winners I can think of. I can't remember if Dick Thaler was there. I think he was not, but it's not that he wasn't at all interested. It's just not everybody was there.
Are you thinking about ever doing this type of coffee date again? Because I feel like you're just breeding Nobel Prize winners. So if I could get
I know. Yeah. If you get invited, you better come, right? Who knows? It could.
I will fly to the States for that coffee. I will
put our names down, Colin. We'll be there.
I think it might be that all three of those people were at least a little bit, in Romer's case, more than a little bit, interested in things that were kind of outside their main area. And so that that's what kind of sort of drew them in. Anyway, and so after that, nothing happened. So 3 years later, it's like there was no second date. It didn't feel like, other than certain people who were kind of continued to work on things. John Cohen continued to work on stuff he was doing, and Elliot and so on. And also, actually, Jonathan Schooler was there because he was also at Pitt at that time. He's a social psychologist, and that's the first time I saw the IAT implicit association test, which some of your listeners will know, which is when you see, say, an African American name and an adjective, and you're asked to tap if it's an African American and a negative adjective like evil or pollution, and people tap more quickly if white names are matched with positive adjectives and black names with negative. And Jonathan actually had us do it. It was really thrilling. So I learned that. That was fun. And it was a very lively, interesting group of people. And so there was a certain amount of like alumni, okay, now I knew Jonathan Schooler. Now I knew John Cohen. And they knew, Peter Diamond and Al. But it was just not clear there was like a research agenda that anyone was going to work on. But that's okay. That's okay. So fast forward to the year 2000, and then at Princeton, Reed Montague was there for a year at the Center for Advanced Study. He was my first collaborator in neuroscience. He's now at Virginia Tech. And he and a couple of other people at Princeton organized sort of a follow-up meeting. And Ariel Rubinstein was there. Angus Deaton came, later Nobel Prize winner.
Again.
And Angus was great. He had exactly the right attitude, and I think things had proceeded, and maybe he had thought about it more or what have you. But he basically said, look, I study consumption, aggregate level consumption data. Like, do people buy more food when they're richer or less food? And the data we have and the models are very restrictive.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we don't really think econometrically the restrictions we put on in order to estimate certain things are really plausible.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know what else to do. And, maybe neuroscience can offer some like new ideas. So he was what I call kind of like a cheerleader, right? He wasn't going to drop his research and do neuroeconomics, but he was willing to come to a meeting and listen to people talk about it. And it was like, if you have more meetings where you have things to say that are very close to how we think about consumption in theory and economics, that would be cool, and blah, blah, blah. And so that was very useful, was to have, because at the same time, there were people who are very skeptical, both in print and then a little bit just in like, what a waste of time, blah, blah, blah. I'll tell you one story that still bothers me. So there's a famous person at Stanford, and I saw him at a meeting in around maybe 2010, I think, about organizational economics. And I knew him a little bit. We met at different meetings here and there. And he came up and said, we'd love to have someone like you at Stanford. If you get tired of that neuroscience stuff and want to get back to like serious economics, let us know. And later, it was kind of like me too. Later, people who knew him said, "Oh, that's just him." He says that, yeah, he's like that with everyone. That's not an excuse.
He's just an arsehole.
And I was a little upset that he would think that was an appropriate exchange. And I was a pretty senior professor at that time. I had a chair. I was working at Caltech. Like, imagine if you were like a young grad student.
Yeah, I'd be crying in a corner.
I mean, you could be crushed, right?
Yeah.
And the fact that somebody says, "Oh, he says that to everybody," even told that to Colin Camerer. I mean, that's not much consolation. Anyway, so
it might not make you feel better, but it makes me feel better if someone's even an asshole to you.
Yeah. No. Yeah, and actually that's true. I think knowing that it does, like in a statistical sense, it does depersonalize it. It's like you're not the only person who said this to, and Reed Montague. Yeah, Reed Montague was great because he's another person who's very kind of optimistic, and he's just very kind of special. He had been an athlete. I think he has this kind of athlete confidence.
Oh, nice.
And so when some of the critical papers came out, he's like, that's great. You know what that means? They're scared. It was almost like political advertising, right? They're scared that you're doing something new that's going to really like upset the apple cart. Like, that's great. I'm like, did you read this paper? Anyway, so people like Deaton, later Jim Heckman, the people who came to our original meeting in '97, like Paul Romer, were, they were at least showing up and they were showing interest, and that was great. And then I think the next major thing that happened was research started to get done. So Paul Glimcher at NYU was interested. His early part of his career was actually recording single unit, what's called single units, recording individual neuron spiking, like from monkeys, so that the monkeys, for example, have to move their eye. They use what's called a random dot motion. So the idea is that there's dots and they move a little bit to the right or the left, and then they revert back. So you just see these dots moving. And in some of the displays, a lot of the movement is in one direction, and some of the displays in the other direction. So the animals have to figure out, are there more dots moving left or right?
Mm-hmm.
And it takes them a couple of seconds, and then they have to move their eye. And if they make if they think it's left, they move to the left, and then they get a score to juice if they're right. So it's basically they do hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these perceptual trials. And so Paul had come to economics from way, way outside, from neuroscience.
Mm-hmm.
And in the field of people who were studying these in an area called LAP, lateral interparietal cortex, like emotion area, there was an ongoing debate, like, what are these signals from that region? Are they signals of like whether I'm going to move my eye, or is it a signal of value, like I'm going to get a reward if I move my eye? Is it some combination? And in his book, which was really beautiful, he said there was this big debate about whether it was beliefs, intentions to move, or value. And he said, I realized if it was value, is an easy way to find out. You change the probability of getting reward and you change the amount of juice and you should get more signals. Mm-hmm. And that's what he did. So he did a bunch of very beautiful, careful experiments. It's really hard work because you have to, you implant electrodes in the monkeys and then you have to record. And, it's not like the neuron tells you what it is, like it's logging on Zoom, like, hi, I'm a dopamine neuron, right? You have to just, from the spike trains, there's kind of like a fingerprint of how different neurons work, and you have to record a lot of neurons and then kind of average them.
Is this ever going to be the
it's just hard work
of neuroscience that we're just, we lag you into a machine and we'll be able to identify the neuron? Is that something we can dream of? We can hope for?
I think they've made a lot of progress. The people who do this have a pretty clear. I think have a pretty clear understanding, and also a lot of like many areas of science. Neuroscience is getting. I know you're kind of half facetious, but it's getting more automated, right? So that we can. There's more and more. As you have more and more data, you don't have to have a technician who kind of looks at the chart. Some algorithm looks at the chart and says it's dopamine or glutamate, and then you may have to double check and so on, or you have a confidence rating. But that's been actually extremely helpful. Is that a lot more automated tools have come along, so you can collect bigger samples, and then open science is really roaring also in neuroscience. So that there's a big movement to share data. There are these brain banks that have hundreds and hundreds of open source, brain scans and things to share. So that's very good.
A brain bank. It sounds like
brain bank. I know, like a vampire. I know. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. They I don't think they worked that much on marketing, or maybe it's called biobank or something like that. But
that doesn't sound
better. Brain archive. I don't know. It does make you think of like hundreds of brains and formaldehyde, right? Like in
and all the jars lined up.
Oh, gross. Yeah, no. Mm-mm.
So, and then what happened with me was that neuroeconomics started to take off. So Paul Glimcher and quite a few other people like Mike Platt, who was a postdoc, were coming to they were interested in the neuro part, and the economics was just reward decision making. It's that they were studying basic processes of choice, and in a few cases, it was things that were more special interest in economics, like people began to get very interested in social preferences. What's the link between altruism, empathy, intentions? There's a booming research in kind of moral neuroscience. So coming partly from philosophy and, all these different angles. Let me talk about something else that will situate how I think neuroeconomics is important, which is David Marr. So in the
like Marr's levels of analysis?
Marr's levels, yes, exactly.
Oh my God, this takes me back. I took a class in neuroeconomics. Those levels showed up every lecture. I will never forget them.
Good. You shouldn't. It was the times I start out with this. So now I call it a Marr chart, just so people can remember. So it's David Marr, M-A-R-R, 2 R's. And he was interested in vision. And so and several people like Tinbergen had proposed the similar classifications, but Marr, I think, just kind of like hit the spot. And he basically said you only really understand a system if you understand the computation. I call it functionality. What's it for? What is it for? What is it adapted to do? The algorithmic centerpiece, like what are the equations, the code, the blueprint? Like if you were to build an artificial bird or house, what are the instructions you would need? And then mechanistic, which is flesh and blood. Mm-hmm. Okay, so think about something like a habit, which is something we're studying now. In economics and marketing and most fields, habits are modeled in a very simple way, which is partly right, but leaves the Marr chart out. Habits are usually modeled as if you did something a lot before, you're going to do it more often. So if you go back to preferences, beliefs, and constraints in economics, it basically is a type of preference in which you have what's called a complementarity. Complementarity means if you like hot dogs, then you might buy mustard to put on your hot dogs. The two things that go together.
Sure. Software
and hardware. And so habit is sometimes called temporal complementarity. The idea is if I did something one time, I want to do it again and do it again and do it again. And so you can write a very easy equation, right? The utility of something in period 3 depends on whether you consumed it in period 2 and period 1 and so on. But that's not what habit's for, right? What habit is for is neural autopilot. right? The idea is if you're in a situation with a set of choices, a really good thing to do is to think, what did I do last time? Was it reliably rewarding, which is a number kind of like in control theory, information theory. It's a number that says the rewards I've been getting from this have been reliable. Like the reward prediction error, which you probably remember, Merle, I hope. Reward prediction error is close to zero, right? So reward prediction error is the idea that I pick something, I have a predicted reward, I get the actual reward, and then I adjust it. And that we think that's how the brain is learning, what to buy. So that's habit mode. And the beauty of habit mode is you just have to look up two numbers. What did I do? And was it reliably rewarding? And if the reliability number is close to zero, just make the same choice. I don't look at, right? That's what habit's for, and that's how it works, we think. And the mechanistic understanding comes from a lot of research in animal learning mostly, and from the idea that this is one of the fundamental ideas in neuroeconomics, which I think is proving to be very fruitful but also complicated. There's always more wrinkles, is that there's something like a model-free or habitual system in which if you just think about whether something worked, and you don't think too much about alternatives. So the word model refers to like a decision tree or a map or like an abstract representation of all the possible choices you can make. And then there's model directed, which is much more like, I want to buy a house and I go on Zillow and I look at a whole bunch of dots, and that's my model, is like, where are the houses in the neighborhood and what are the numbers associated with houses and so on. So what habit is for is to save time when you're in a kind of reward stationary environment by doing the same thing over and over, so that your scarce executive function can deal with more complicated problems. And how it works algorithmically is a series of equations that are basically linked to reward prediction error and so forth. A key feature, by the way, is you want to get into habit mode quickly when it's kind of safe, and you get out of habit mode when it's not, right? So in our way of thinking about it, if the reward reliability goes up, like I go to my favorite restaurant and suddenly there's a different chef and it's like, oh, this is terrible. The reward reliability is bad. There's a negative reward prediction error. Then the reliability goes up, unreliability, I should say. The unreliability goes up. And I think, oh, what else do you have on the menu, right? I'm out of habit mode.
Sure.
So, and again, we use the term autopilot because it's like an airplane. People can sort of envision, how you want to automate as much stuff as you can because flying an airplane is very, very complicated. And the same, human beings want to automate as much as we can because being a human being is very, very complicated, right?
It almost sounds like scarcity again, right? Of, evolutionary response to scarcity is you need to automate as many processes as possible because you just don't have enough brain power or attention to take the time over every decision. Yes. And
exactly.
I'm interested, like the process. I mean, this is the first time I'm hearing about this because I never got to take a neuroscience class. So I'm just going to ask you some questions.
Yeah, that's good. You're a good student. Yeah.
But in the way it's described, it's very neutral of emotion. Is there any way of describing it that also builds in the idea that it's just comfortable, or do people like having habits? Like
that's a really good. There's a basic level, but also a deep level. So you can put emotions in a couple of natural ways. One is it could be a component of value. So the habit might be. When daddy comes home, the 2-year-old hears the keys in the lock, like a Pavlovian cue, like bing, 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 bing. And the 2-year-old comes toddling over, daddy. And the reason they do that is, and as they get older and older, they run faster and faster. And when they're little, they fall down. It's a cute video on YouTube. And so the emotion is part of value, right? And that's one example. Another part is, it is true that we've tilted the particular model I have in mind to make it very kind of robotics and control sort of theoretic. So there's two free parameters, and those are going to have to do the work of things like you want them to do, and also individual differences. One is the learning rate, which is basically how quickly do you update reward prediction. And so that's thought to be associated with intelligence or working memory. Like across animals, you might see differences. Rats are slower than dolphins and what have you. And so the learning rate.
A lot of neuroscience being done on dolphins.
Dolphins are slippery. They're pretty hard. it's not neuroscience, but I think there's a lot of what's called comparative cognition, where you try to study. I think dolphins are just thought from various tests to be pretty relatively smart. Actually, one of my not a collaborator, but Greg Burns has studied neuroscience of dogs, which turns out to be pretty interesting and difficult because you have to get the dogs. He said that the hardest part is it takes hours and hours to get them to kind of lie still in a brain scanner, so their brain's not moving around. So like the same with probably little children is difficult at certain ages. Anyway, so there's two free parameters. One is a learning rate. That's kind of mundane but basic. The other is a threshold, right? So if the threshold for moving out of habit and into habit, if the threshold is really high, it means you're very habitual. You keep doing things unless they're really terrible. And if the threshold is really low, you're less habitual. So that might capture things like sensation seeking and novelty. Right, like if it's pleasurable to try new things, it's going to look like a low threshold or some additional process we haven't put in place, like a deliberate exploration.
Okay.
I haven't thought too hard about whether there's another neuroscience is not looking too high and low for kind of a grand unified theory. Usually there's sort of like modules, and even those like end up being quite complicated. Like when I think, and I should add, like this neuroautopilot theory of habits is quite a bit different than addictive habits, which have biological addiction, tolerance, and withdrawal. I mean, those are going to work in a much more kind of ruthless way, where you essentially it's harder to get out of habit mode because the mechanism is just working very differently, and some of those may have emotions associated with them in some really crucial way. Like domestic violence, I think, is an extremely unpleasant but interesting model system because often the victims of violence feel very trapped, and often there's a cycle in which they kind of forgive the abuser, and that's part of what maintains, if you think of it as a habit or a sort of co-evolved habit of interdependency. There's a lot of emotions there, right? There's anger, remorse, guilt, forgiveness, and all those things can feel really high intensity emotions. Like the forgiveness might feel absolutely wonderful if you think that he's I'm going to say he because most domestic violence is men. So these could be very strong emotions that are actually contributing value as well as potentially information. Like somehow you forget about this long experience history of negative reward prediction errors because some emotion sort of some other process sort of overrides it. So there are other things that have elements of habit which aren't going to fit too much in this framework. We're thinking of things like ordering your favorite foods, commuting to work, your daily routines like brushing your teeth, and maybe going to the gym. And stuff like that. So I think the MAR chart is a huge contribution, and economics just doesn't fit in because they don't care mostly about the mechanistic part at all. Yes. That's where the term as if, and the computational part is almost always, it's almost like the functionality and the computation are like fused together. So as you know, economists are obsessed with rationality and optimality and endogenizing. So there's a huge amount of interest in, you mentioned scarcity, Sarah, in rational inattention. So attention is scarce. Okay, that's great. It's costly. How does the brain like allocate it optimally? Right. And so that's kind of like a functional argument. Like, what is it for? Attention is there's some goal that you want to get. And like, how does the mathematics work? But often those are two different things, right? And the first one is almost more like normative, and the second one's more like descriptive, which allows you to think about maladaptation and things like that. So we've been trying to. I've been to a lot of meetings with people working on rational inattention and trying to kind of communicate better. And basically, these are just typical tastes in a scientific field. A chunk of the rational inattention people could care less how attention actually works. They just could care less. I mean, they have their way of thinking about it.
Sure.
And then another chunk are actually pretty curious. So if and fortunately, one of the curious people is Mike Woodford, who's a macroeconomist of all things at Columbia, and I think it's just as a matter of scholarship. He thinks that rational inattention basically came, as it did, from Horace Barlow in 1961, thinking about efficient coding in the visual system, which was really sort of a precursor to MAR 20 years later. So there a lot of the pieces of thinking about optimal use of these scarce brain resources, exactly as you highlighted. The neuroscientists are well aware of that. And in some areas, like sensory, they have extremely well-developed theories. We know exactly what's going on. That's why you can produce optical illusions. We know how to trick the system into making a mistake, but it's not a mistake that's going to kill you. It's just a mistake that's entertaining for a psychology course. But the fact that you can trick the system means you understand the system.
I don't think you're going to be allowed to play people with a lethal mistake you can make in a psychology experiment.
Yeah.
I don't think you're going to get that through ethics after what Milgram did.
Right.
Just
right. Well, I'll tell you one thing. I'll tell you one thing we did though. That now let me talk a little bit about empirics. So my colleague and I were interested in fear, and so we wanted to run some really intense fear experiments.
Right.
And his name is Dean Mobb. So one of the things he did was he bought a tarantula. They're called a Brazilian salmon tarantula. Mm-hmm. They're big. Mm-hmm. And in Brazil, they're sometimes known as bird tarantulas because there are stories about the tarantulas eating birds. Now, I think the Brazilians just made that up to tease people,
Yeah, scare away foreigners.
I'm not entirely sure.
As if they're not scared enough.
Yeah. No, I have. So, for example, Australia also has the clock spider, which is named that way because it's as big as a clock. So,
really?
I would actually believe that the bird spider genuinely eats birds.
Yeah. I think most likely somebody saw that happen once, and that was enough to get to get this cool name. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so he did some scanning studies where there's a tarantula near your foot, and how afraid are people when the tarantula is pointing toward you versus pointing away from you. Really beautiful studies. And you get, as you can imagine, you get really strong signals in a very kind of upstream, what we call evolutionarily conserved, which means all mammals, it's sort of the old part of the brain, all mammals have this region called periaqueductal gray, PAG. Anyway, so he's very interested in making people as afraid as you can while they're actually safe. right. So we did an experiment at a haunted house.
No.
So in an hour from here, people built this facility. It's this married couple who are really interesting. They built this warehouse facility, and you go through 17 rooms. It's called 17th Door. And each room, some of the rooms, they're not very scary, which is good. That's like the control group, right? The control condition. It's beautiful. It's almost like they were doing a scientific experiment, except called how can I scare people in different interesting ways? And we were interested in a scientific experiment called what happens when you scare people in different interesting ways? It's like, hello. So we bought these sensors called E4 Empatica sensor that record skin conductance, heart rate, accelerometer. And so we actually did, since you mentioned ethics, Merle, we went to the review board and said, we want to measure people, we want to put these sensors on people and have them go through the haunted house and see how afraid they are in terms of body sensation, and then ask some questions. Mm-hmm. And they were like, well, tell us about the haunted house. And like this, and one of the people, I can't say too much detail, but one of the people on the committee, we had a list of the different rooms and what was in them, because they have it very carefully timed out that, there's somebody jumps out, or this guy's taking a shower and the prison shower is set in a prison. Right. And one of the people said, one of the guys said, can I see the list of things? I want to see what they're like. They're like, you don't want to see this list.
Just sign off the form. Let's just keep moving.
So anyway, so we were able to measure. And actually, the argument that kind of got us over the top that we could actually do this was, we're not exposing people to these risks. Like, if we don't do the experiment measuring the sensors, they're going to go through anyway. All we're going to do is taking people who volunteered and they signed this big waiver and about liability and what have you, and then we're just measuring them. And the risks from the measurement process are really minimal.
That's true.
This is not some complicated machine, and it's And so they like that argument. There's some beautiful studies. For example, if you want to study what happens when people are oxygen deprived, what you do is you go to Everest Base Camp, which is like 17,000 feet up or something, and then you take people who have put themselves in this position of being a bit oxygen deprived, and then you test like Stroop tests and working memory, and what happens when your body's oxygen starved. So people have approved experiments like that on the same reason, right? It's not that we dragged volunteers up to the Everest, we took people who were there anyway.
A casual holiday trip with your participants.
Yeah.
A whole bunch.
Yeah.
Wow, very smart.
So the main reason I'm telling you this story, besides ethics, got me thinking about it, was one of the things I would like to see is more biology. I mean, this haunted house study is not exactly neuroscience because we're not measuring anything about the brain, but we are measuring all these biological correlates. Mm-hmm. And in principle, they actually have a lot of footage of people as they go through. So in theory, you could try to take a security camera mm-hmm. and look at people's faces and things like that. Again, the faces are really important from the point of view of emotion. So we're not doing brain scanning there, but
Shame. The portable MRI hasn't been invented yet. But
yeah, exactly. You could. There are portable EEGs which seem to be making a lot of progress. Cool. That you could wear like a baseball cap, and so it's conceivable soon that you could actually have portable EEG, and that would be useful.
For sure.
If you're interested in what things are in the cortical surface, depending where you think different functions are. Anyway, so we're very keen on using a combination of mechanistic data and then field data, where the neurosciences tells us to kind of look for something interesting. So we have gym data, for example, where people go to the gym on certain days, and you try to fit that to a habit type model. Do they really build up these habits where you go when you go? And the gym looks more like hunger. It looks more like if you go one day, they're not that likely to go the very next day. But there's like a waiting period, and you're more likely to go like 6 days later. But it's also not that regular. It's not that regular. It's kind of spot. So we have a lot of data sets, and we're trying to explore neuroscientifically informed theory in everyday data, and some of those are sensor data as well. Like if you get Fitbit data and things like that, you can say when people are sleeping. The tricky part is to try to match sensors with other, like I'd like to ask people other questions, like if people exercise more, are they happier? Are their relationships better? Are there impacts on social and economic outcomes? And those are harder. You have to just find a technology partner or sort of do it yourself. Like give out 300 Fitbits and then see what happens to people. So I think that, and speaking about behavioral science, I think we live in a golden age of social science, actually, because we have so much data. And I think partly the data and partly just other things. And we have very complicated problems that people clearly realize now are not, like AIDS is not a medical problem. It's partly a medical problem. But early on, a lot of it had to do with the social problem of getting men to wear condoms.
Sure.
Right? That has nothing to do with medicine. That's not medicine. That's a behavior change problem, right? Or needle exchange, which is partly kind of like a political problem. Mm-hmm. So almost all of these interesting challenges, obesity, opioid addiction, online education for poor and rich kids, pandemics, COVID is partly, there's a medical part, there's an epidemiological part, and then there's like a political social part. Like in America, there's a bunch of people who think wearing a mask is giving in to some myth. It's almost like a psychiatric problem, know.
I've seen some of those videos from I think Florida Town Hall where lots of people make a very passionate case for why it's against their human rights to wear masks. Yeah. Right. Exactly. So there's an element of like fake news and how people form worldviews and conspiracies, which sort of plays a role. So I think that's pretty exciting, and I think more private foundations are interested in this kind of thing. I think they tend to think of these as
it's like I'm not going to make grants to the epidemiologist only if I want to study like when to reopen the economy in a country that's struggling like here. I need to talk to economists. Austin Goolsbee has a new paper basically showing that even when businesses reopened, a lot of people just didn't want to go. Mm-hmm. So it's not just a matter of telling businesses you can open your restaurant again. It's like, how do you get people to go? That's a behavior change, fear, emotion problem, right? It's a big tangle of all these different things.
No, absolutely. Okay, so that was us talking to Colin Camerer, and I feel like I have had a history lesson. I feel like I was there. I'm feeling all the emotions. My brain is fried, and you know what? I'm not remotely done with it. I want more. And luckily, because we are, and with me, I mean Sarah and I, are excellent at marketing. So guess what? This was only part 1, and next week we'll tune in for a part 2, in which Colin will continue talking about neuroeconomics, obviously, also where he thinks the field is going and what he is currently working on and hopes to continue working on for quite a long time. So please do tune into that. And of course, that episode, as always, will have a proper after chat where Sarah and I reflect on the one hell of a lecture we've just gotten. I'm really excited for it. I really enjoyed this episode.
And if you had any thoughts or brainwaves while listening to us speak to Colin, then please let us know on the social media platforms. We'd love to hear from you. Would you have liked to have been a fly on the wall in that meeting with all those future Nobel Prize winners and figure out how you can get invited to the next meeting? It's probably happening right now, I'm sure. Please let us know what you liked and what you're excited to hear about from the next episode. I can't wait for you guys to hear it.
Yeah, see you next week.